this morning is from Psalms 139, selected verses. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I may know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. I try to count them. They are more than the sand. I come to the end. I am still with you. The second reading from the New Testament, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 5 through 12. For we do not proclaim ourselves. We proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus' sake. For it is the God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," who has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you.
It's good to be with you. I don't know if you know much more about the relationship Diane and I had. Maybe she's talked about it, but we were together at Horizon House for about 8 years. I actually have retired a couple years ago, but I still go back a couple times a month to have these programs that she alluded to. But I did want to say, if someone asked, how was it you came to be with us today? Well, you can blame Diane. And she was... it's hard for me to say was, because I will always think of you in that role, Diane, but among well, she was a nurse manager, which is a very highly responsible position at Horizon House, working on the 3rd floor, overseeing all the other nursing staff and taking care of all those patients, and talk about someone who had just a high professional ethic, deeply compassionate heart, and always a sense of what we needed to be after for the best care of our residents, our friends. Diane was just an incredible gift to Horizon House, and I know that she is much missed there. So thank you for that, Diane. Thank you for this invitation to be here today. And I did want to say, I don't think I've actually been in worship with this congregation before. Peter and I have spent some time together over the years through the conference, and I've been here for a number of meetings. But what's interesting to me is, as I thought about it, is that I've known, I think, most of the clergy here who have been here and spent. Bruce, right? Going way back, we spent a lot of time talking about covenant community and what that meant, and intentional community, and Sam Sawitsky and his Orthodox background, and Micah Bush and Mark Travis, and so I have a sense of connection with this congregation. So Good to be here with you all today. Now, Roberta comes to you from England, right? So my question is, did she talk to you at all about this amazing thing that happened recently, the marriage of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle? Did she talk about that? She's been gone. Okay, well, all right. Then that's good. So now I have my opportunity to lift this up. So, many of us, did any of you see that event? Okay. So I would not have seen it, but my wife DVR'd it, and we were having breakfast. I think it must have been Saturday. Anyway, she said, well, I'm going to watch this. Do you want to watch it? Well, I started watching it. Actually, I was amazed. It was a wedding. And it was a worship service, and now I've forgotten his name again. I had to make sure. Yes, Michael Curry. And it was interesting to hear the BBC people say something like, well, this is a fiery sermon, and we don't know quite what to make of this. And Gayle King on CBS said, yeah, it's what happens every Sunday morning in the black church. And then someone saying, it was almost like a sermon. It was a sermon! Come on! So anyway, it was an interesting thing, but what was really interesting to me was that Michael Curry quoted Teilhard de Chardin. Now, I don't know how many of you, does that ring any bell with anybody? You heard it that day, but Teilhard de Chardin. So, Teilhard I looked him up on Wikipedia, and it said French philosopher. He would be appalled. He was in the early, he was born in the 1800s later, but his career was primarily the earliest 20th century. And he would have considered himself a paleontologist, a geologist, a theologian, priest, professor, and writer. He was a Jesuit, but he had massive interests in all kinds of things, but primarily in those deep sciences of our origins. And what distinguishes Teilhard, now in the sermon, Michael Curry lifted up that thing that Teilhard said, it's a quote of his, that the day that we really discover the power of love will be the second time that humanity has discovered fire. So he went off from that quote and talked about Teilhard's take on love as powerful and as life-changing and earth-changing as fire. But beneath all that was Teilhard's deep interest in evolution, and evolution being kind of the groundwork and the foundation of his kind of evolving theology. And what he came to understand was that you cannot ultimately separate matter from spirit. He saw evolution as God's hand working and moving in, through, and with the world, and ultimately in, through, and with humanity over the eons, and that finally there was no distinction between the movement and evolution of matter and the movement and evolution of spirit. He saw them as a unity. And he talked about all things moving to the omega point, which is kind of his concept of God. All of us becoming the body of Christ. He used that Christian image, but this idea of unity and moving toward the omega point, which is ultimately the unity that is God. That was kind of very simplistic, and those of you that know Teilhard well might say, well, that's just the half of it. Well, that's okay. Just that much. That's all the theology I'm going to lay on you right now. The text for today, when Diane told me it was this Sunday, and I went and I looked at the lectionary, I'm a lectionary preacher, 2 Corinthians 4, including verse 7, I said, that is about my favorite Bible verse. We have this treasure in earthen vessels to show that the surpassing power belongs to God, to the divine, and not to us. That has been, for me, all my life, a very important kind of touchstone. The idea that, talked about, you have this group meeting in turbulent times. The Apostle Paul talks about the perplexity that can be part of life. The feeling of being struck down. The feeling of being persecuted. All those things that weigh down on us. And he said, but this is all part of it. But we are these earthen vessels, these clay jars, these clay pots. And it helps to show that ultimately the truth and the light and the love that we are preaching is not about us and who we are, but it's about the divine. It's about the light and the power and the love of God in Jesus. So his word here to the church at Corinth is, no matter how broken and frustrating and difficult life can be, no matter which dreams are shattered, no matter what outcomes do not follow the path that you might have envisioned, the light of God is still shining through. And that's been a very, very important message for me, even though I have not been persecuted as a white, male Protestant in our culture, even though I have not been struck down by chronic illness like many people I know. Nevertheless, Diane and I both know and come to terms with, to some degree, our mortality, the reality of our finite nature, and both spent a lot of years, as have many of you, watching friends and family deal with the harsh realities of life and having to come to terms with that. And so this light of God shining in spite of our mortality is a hopeful message. A friend of mine, a Lutheran clergy, in our last text study, was talking about this passage. He said, in case we have any doubts about what this is saying about our humanity, say, we took a trip to Arles, France once, and we went to this museum, and here were this collection of earthenware jars and pots and vessels that they'd taken from the surrounding area, Roman era, and they were just so commonplace. And he said, in the Rhone River, which flows through Arles, there's kind of a dark spot. Well, that's where the Romans took and dumped all their garbage into the river over those centuries, and that dark streak is mostly broken clay vessels and jars. They were the disposable cups of the day. So that's kind of a graphic allusion to our fleeting nature. But there's a problem that can arise from too much emphasis on that. This idea that we are just this mortal vessel, and that's all we are, and it's all about God. For one thing, people have drawn from that kind of a dualistic way of looking at the world. If all we are is broken clay pots, jars, something passive, then maybe we don't matter. Maybe our bodies and how we treat them and how we look at ourselves doesn't matter so much. Maybe even more starkly, maybe if it's all about being spiritual, about holding God's light, about letting the light shine through us and our bodies just being a side note, well, what about the bodies of others? What about the physical existence of others? What about the difficulties, the hardships, the trauma that others have gone through? I've heard about Christians down through the years, whether it's the conquistadors or the ardent missionaries, or in our own time, one might even argue that there are people of faith who focus so much on the spiritual and being right with God and having everything spiritually lined up that the needs and the struggles and the pain and the trauma of our fellow human beings is easily set aside and not taken seriously. And one more thing in terms of what might come of this dualism is just our whole view of this planet, of this earth that we inhabit, and its health and its well-being and its integrity. The integrity and the health, the goodness of creation being deeply important. So we have this tension. We have this tension between someone like Teigen saying it matters and it flows, and that we are mortal in our being and in our life here. So we pay attention to the things I just talked about, and on some level we kind of know that this is true. This life matters. We know it instinctually, intrinsically. We know that this life matters. We know that our lives matter. We know that, as Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. That matters. Coming from the Hebrew Testament. These are the things that guide us, and they are important. But there's even one further step. And I kind of got it as I was thinking about this second passage that Diane read from the Psalms, and I know you heard it, but I just wanted to lift up a couple of verses once again. It was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. There is going way back in the words of the psalmist, this claiming of who we are, our whole selves, our whole being, our physical existence, our spiritual, everything about us that is in God's sight wonderful, in God's sight a gift. And the last piece was, how weighted to me are your thoughts, O God, how vast is the sum of them. So God's immenseness, God's majesty is retained. I try to count them, they are more than the sand. I come to the end. I am still with you. I am still with you. And I just heard in that a little insight that for me, at least at this stage in my life, is important. Not only is God with us, we say this, God be with you, God is with us, God will be with you, but we are with God. We are caught up in partnership with, we are in tracking with and a part of what God is doing. What we are and who we are all matters. Is it Karen? So, I was thinking about a dear friend of mine who was in her 90s, had passed not long ago, and we had to say goodbye to her and at her service. And what stood out for me, she was an amazing person, as many people are in their way. She was a person who did a lot in the community in terms of she volunteered and directed a food bank for a lot of years of her life. She taught classes at our church, the Lutheran church where I grew up. She was very involved in the ecumenical community, and I didn't even know that she'd been given a Brotherhood Award by a national multi-faith organization at one point in her life. I didn't know all this. What I knew about her was that she would cook food for confirmation kids on Wednesday night. She would drive people who are developmentally disabled around to their appointments. She would, she'd be there to sit with an elder who just needed some time spent, some company for a time. She lived a life, oh, by the way, her greatest aspiration, according to her daughter, was to be a grandmother. She was a grandmother and a great-grandmother. And what I'm getting at is, for me, there's been a temptation in my life to look back and say, okay, where did I really make a difference? Where did I really, where did what I did really sync with what God was calling me to do and who God wanted me to be and what God was doing in me? And I might think about, leading a great worship service, running a program, directing some effort in the community. But this is a reminder that we don't know necessarily. That as we evolve in our lives, as we move along and change and transform from era to era, from age to age, from decade to decade, we just don't know. We might have run this, we might have started that, we might have accomplished something great in our field, we might have had 10 kids and 50 grandkids or whatever. We might have done some amazing things, but we don't know where the light that we think is important could even be outshone by some of the things that we don't necessarily recognize. All that is to say, God's light is shining in us. But the light that we bring, the light that Teigen wanted to lift up, the love, the presence, the time, just being that we offer, might not only be part of that light, but might be just a shining beacon in our world. that might be seen now, it might be seen later, it might be appreciated now, it might be appreciated later. It might never be noted specifically, but it's a part of something deep and great and wonderful, and we are a part of it. Not just light that happens to be refracted through us, but we, our gifts, our talents, our simple being, are simply, living our lives as we live them. A great gift, a great light, love moving forward. So we may be perplexed. We may feel persecuted or struck down or somehow maybe just set aside or somehow just made aware of our limits. But in the midst of that, we may also be us, ourselves, who we are in our fullness, just the light that the world needs. Amen.